So you should have read that synopsis of what we call sacred history, and that's from a very Orthodox rabbinic Jewish perspective. And we'll get into what I mean by that and why it's important to note that. But we're going to start moving towards this divide between Judaism and Christianity, right? We've been talking about kind of the shared story. And interestingly, they share the same story still, but how it's read, how it's understood, and the direction it goes start to shift. So I want to start looking at these differing perspectives on this shared story. And as we move along, I'll pull out one specific part. But here again, this is what we're moving into is no longer just what they have in common, but where these two faiths, as they're expressed and understood today, get their first kind of break from each other. Now remember, we're talking at all times what it means to be the people of God. And part of that is understanding the story of God being involved with his people. And God's involvement, we've talked about God as being holy, God as being involved in history, right? And those things, those are not just unique to the Jewish God. If we had read the book of Numbers, we would have seen a story where a king wants to curse the Israelites, and he hires this kind of local prophet who hears from God, and he wants the prophet to curse the Israelites. And so he takes him up to one mountain, and he blesses the Israelites. And the king's like, wait, I'm paying you to curse them. What's going on? And so then he says, let's go to another mountain. And so he blesses them from there. But why would, and this happens a few times before the king just finally gets fed up and says, never mind, go away. But the reason the king would move to different locations is that king was polytheistic. He would believe in multiple gods, and gods would have areas of authority and areas of control. So he's taking this prophet, hoping you'll hear from a different God, and that different God will curse these people. But that wouldn't be necessarily because any one of these gods would care about anyone. It's because those gods have authority. People in that context exist for the sake of the gods. There is this sense of holiness in one sense, of a separateness, of a differentness between the gods and people. But not necessarily in the Jewish sense, the way God is holy for the Jews. And the God of history, the gods of the polytheists of that region are involved in the day-to-day actions of life. They have to be placated, they have to be pleased. But remember, we also talked about the God of the Jews is the God who cares about his people, the God who hears, and the God who is absolutely other and above even the other gods, right? Because he conquered the gods of Egypt. He's the God who created everything. He's not a God who's part of creation. So these are all important things to remember. But part of that God's involvement with history has to do with providence. The idea of God's control over everything that's happening. The Jewish God is not a regional God. He's not just a Jewish God that has power in certain areas or over certain people. He has control of everything. And so the interesting thing about this kind of sacred history that you've read a synopsis of, when you read it in the Bible, in the Hebrew Scriptures, you get this sense that everything that happens, whether it has to do in Israel proper, with Egypt, with Assyria, with Babylon, with Persia, everything is under the authority of the one God of the Jews. The Jews are taken into captivity not because the Babylonian gods are stronger, but because God has ordained it. God has placed Nebuchadnezzar on the throne. You have this book of Daniel where this prophet Daniel speaks to Babylonian and then to Persian rulers. And you have this book of Esther. Esther doesn't even use the name of God. Remember, we talked about the kind of holiness, the otherness of the name of God that's not even pronounced eventually. Esther is a later work, so the name of God is not in it, but all throughout it is this contrast between this enemy who wants to destroy the Jews and the Jews themselves. And this enemy makes his decisions by casting lots, sort of like rolling dice. He's governed by chance and hatred. And chance falls in such a way that he's going to get the opportunity to kill the Jews. He's going to wipe them out. He hates them all. And then God, in a sense, takes control of chance. God makes a move in such a way behind the scenes and under the surface. He's not mentioned by name, but the Jews are saved, not by chance, but by providence. This is essential to the Jewish identity and to the Christian understanding of God. God is in control of history. And so that's why this history plays such a key role in the prophets and in the law and in every aspect. This is the understanding of God as the God of history. This is what separates him from other gods that are engaged with the world. This God is not only engaged with the world, he's in control of the whole world, even when you can't see it. Even when things seem bad, God is in control. That's a real Jewish idea. That's a very strong Christian idea, and incredibly important to the understanding of how they worship, how they live, what they believe. So this is a timeline. Now, I got that summary, that synopsis from a fairly orthodox or conservative, those are technical terms, and I'm sorry to use them. Later on, we'll talk about the different branches of Judaism very briefly. But what I mean by that is a pretty strictly rabbinic Jewish, modern rabbinic Jewish website. And this timeline comes from that. Scholars, you find scholars all over the place on dates. You find scholars all over the place on what actually happened and what didn't. But to understand the belief systems, what most Jews believe, what most Christians believe, there is a sense that this history is real. It's a sacred history, right? History is recorded in retrospect. So you won't find in here oftentimes what you find in other histories, because this history is interested in specific actions of God relating to specific people. And you only find other nations involved in these histories when they relate to God's people. So that said, it's just to give you a sense of kind of what are key events, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph in slavery, the Exodus, the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, moving into the Promised Land, the period of the Judges, which we're going to talk about a little specifically momentarily, the first kings, the great King Solomon, the building of the temple. Israel splits into two kingdoms, right? You should have read about that. Because of Solomon's disobedience, because he marries all these wives and he starts to fall into idolatry. This is the recurring theme throughout this, right? The temptation is to worship other gods. The temptation is to be like the other people. The temptation is to do what the other people do, to have some control over your own world. This goes back to that idea of providence, right? God is in control. God is governing all things. And for the Jews to be the people of God, they need to trust in that control. The polytheistic religions of the surrounding nations have these rituals that are meant to kind of garner favor and kind of manipulate the gods. I want this, so I'm going to convince the gods to do that for me. Jewish prayer, Christian prayer, there is prayer. There is an asking of God to do something. But within the kind of the deepest religious ideals of Judaism and Christianity, prayer is not about manipulating God just to get what I want. Prayer may be asking God for what I need, but it's always intended to work within the context of discovering what God's will is. And it's intended to work within that idea of, remember that this is a God who cares and a God who is generous. So it's not like this cruel despot up there in the heavens, occasionally paying attention. There's this very deep relational, loving context. In fact, in the Jewish prophets, the relationship between God and the Israelites is often compared to a marriage relationship in which a husband is loving to a wife and a wife should be loving to her husband, and the two are unified. But then Israel's idolatry is looked at as unfaithfulness, as cheating. Israel is kind of cheating on the husband. Ezekiel is a prophet that gets very graphic with this idea. But the key is it's relational. It's a God who cares, who is generous, but who is worthy of complete and total devotion. He answers prayers, but you're not going to manipulate him. A lot of the Psalms, a lot of the prophets are like, look, I'm tired of your sacrifices. I'm not one of these little polytheistic gods that you can just pay me a bill and I'll give you what you want. That's not the underlying realities for even the most kind of sacrificial elements of the Jewish system. It's not like God's up there needing to be bribed or manipulated by sacrifices. There's something else going on with the sacrificial system within Judaism, something different in many ways from what's going on with many of the other surrounding religions, at least from within the Jewish perspective. This is the understanding. So that sense of God's providence in all these events, right, and how another element of these faiths is God's mercy, His returning, He is forgiving if you repent, right? So a lot of the history is this cycle of people of God hear from God, they start to do what they're supposed to do, but then they kind of forget, they move away from God, they start worshiping other idols, they start participating in things that they're not supposed to do, and so God allows things to happen and puts pressure on them, and that kind of captures their attention. They repent, they come back, or maybe they don't. But that cycle is very important. That sense of if you do what is right, God is going to bless it. If you don't do what is right, God is going to discipline. That's a very real theme throughout this story. There's not a complete theme. We'll get to that later, because that comes into one of the key differences between rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, and differences that we'll see really take root, or really take blossom. I would say the root goes much deeper, but they're manifest in the period of the New Testament, when Jesus and his first disciples come to the scene, the church is first founded. You really see this distinctive in what is ultimately God's purpose in things, how we know if we're being obedient or not. These types of things are all part of the divide. But in a shallow reading, or I hate to say shallow, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but a surface reading of this story seems to be saying, Israel, when you do what's right, God is going to bless you. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, there's a whole passage where the nation kind of marches through in column between leaders that are standing on opposing hills, and they turn to face the one leader, and that leader says, if you do these good things, then God will do these good things for you. And then they walk a little bit further, and they turn and face the other hill, and the leaders over there say, if you do these bad things, then God is going to discipline and punish you in these ways. So that theme runs through the history. There's no doubt about it, but there are other things underlying that we'll get into probably next time. But for now, understand that this concept of history, not so much the dates, but the flow of things, Like I said, most of the later dates, starting with the kings, most scholars of various positions and views pretty much agree. Earlier dates, you're going to find a range of what people say, and you'll even find scholars that say some of it didn't happen. That's not important for our discussion, right? We're not doing a historical critical method study of the Bible. We're looking at what Jews believe, what Christians believe, and have believed, and how it impacts their understanding. So this understanding of this is the sacred history. These are the important events. This is what that synopsis is dealing with. And a lot of that synopsis is coming from, like I said, a rabbinic tradition, which is very Deuteronomic, very much based on that Deuteronomy sense of do the good and God will do good, do the bad and God will discipline. But providentially, God is always in control. So this is just another sample of it. Sorry, I meant to mention this. So after the kings, the kingdom split, you get to this point of the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed, and then the southern kingdom of Judah eventually goes into captivity. And so Jeremiah the prophet is a prophet who's telling Judah, you're headed for disaster, right? This was that point I was making, that even though this is an outside power, it's an outside empire, Babylon, God is in control of this, Judah. You had better repent, or God's going to bring disaster on you from Babylon, who's to the north of you. But this is God's doing. Okay, all of this is God's doing. And that's the key point in the prophets. It's not the failure of your God or the victory of their God. This is the one God using this foreign power to discipline you. So that's where the Babylonians conquer Israel. Then after a while, the Jews return from Israel. And I mentioned that story of Esther. That's that miracle of Purim. That's that story. So some Jews have returned. Some Jews still live in Babylon and among the Medes and the Persians who have taken control at that point. So this is really looking at the continuation. Interestingly, when they come back, the Jews are very determined to follow something that we'll talk about next time as well, the Shema, which is a statement from Deuteronomy. Shema means hear, and it's hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. So this very monotheistic declaration from way back in Deuteronomy becomes the heart and soul of the Jewish faith. When they return from captivity, they're like, we're not doing that whole idolatry thing again. We've learned our lesson. We're back. We've maintained the line of priests. We know who are legitimate priests. We've maintained records. We've maintained the lines of kings, and we know who are legitimate nobility. And we've been allowed to come back, and we rebuild the temple, and we rebuild walls around the temple. But what? We have a revival, kind of a renewal of a reading of the law, and we're all going to keep the law, and we kick all the non-Jews out of Jerusalem. And we enforce the keeping of the Sabbath, and we enforce the observance of Passover. All these things, we're going to do this right this time. But what happens? The Jews are still under the control of foreign power. And this begins to raise a lot of questions. What's going on? What haven't we done yet? Why are we still under the foreign power? In fact, you should have read about the Greek persecution. This is horrible, right? People who are, it's hardest on those who don't compromise. What do we do with this? I thought when we obeyed, when we did what was right, things were supposed to go good. And then you get this kind of relative peace restored. The story of Hanukkah is a very interesting story, very central story that after, which I think you should have read, right, that the defeat of the Greeks who were involved in this persecution is the reestablishment of the purification of the temple. But then you get Roman rule. In fact, the Romans are pretty much invited in by corrupt Jewish leaders. And so that's the situation you find yourself in at the time of the New Testament. We came back with a zeal to do what was right, to be truly monotheistic, to worship only God, to establish the practice of all the laws as perfectly as we can. It's called the Reforms of Ezra. And things don't get better. We don't get a new king. And in fact, during the time of the captivity, I'll pull out some of these passages in future discussion, but during the time of the captivity, there are these prophets prophesying the renewal of God's involvement with his people. Jeremiah, who we just read, has this passage where he says, I'm going to make a new covenant with you, and I'm going to transform your hearts. Isaiah and Daniel and Ezekiel prophesy, and they talk about this figure in Daniel, and Ezekiel uses these terms, Son of Man. There are other literature that's not in the Bible, but that's very important from this period and kind of captures the attitudes of this period that talk about this Son of Man figure, this great Messiah of God that's going to come and overthrow the foreign rulers and set up the rule of God over Israel and from Israel over the whole world and bring a period of absolute peace and prosperity and perfection for everyone. And so this is a shift during this time leading up to the captivity, during the time of the captivity. There's this sense within the prophets of God's going to do something a little bit new. It's not going to be like the tribes. It's going to, like in the Judges, it's not going to be just a normal king. He's got this special figure that's going to make things perfect. So this is where you get images in the prophet Isaiah about the lion will lie down with the lamb. The child will put their hand on the hole of the serpent, the adder, and nothing will go wrong. Everything will be perfect. Total peace in the world will be set up by God's Messiah, anointed king over, in a sense, the whole universe. This direct representative of God. Isaiah talks about his strong right arm by which God's going to do these things. So those will become very important. But there's this time of difficulty and where this effort to restore kind of that Deuteronomic code of total obedience to God, totally pure monotheistic worship of only God, doesn't seem to bring about the results that the Jews think that it should at that time. So that creates a real tension, and that's where modern Judaism and Christianity are born out of that tension. Now, nonetheless, these things affect how we understand this history, even looking back. What's important, what stands out. So Jews, and this is part of this divide, coming out of this period, you may have seen that thing that we'll talk about in more depth in a future time, the Great Assembly. The Great Assembly, seeing the amount of how the conquest by other nations hasn't ended. This is where you really get the kind of codification of the scriptures. What is scripture? What is the canon? So this Hebrew canon is really solidified by the Great Assembly. But then there's something else that's really solidified. And that's where we begin to see the idea of the Mishnah. Now the Torah, we've said, is the law of God. Oftentimes the Torah refers to all the written scriptures from Genesis through the accepted canonical prophets. All that history, all that summary that you just read, all those books. Not only Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, but Joshua, Judges, Ruth, the Psalms, the writings, Job, Proverbs, all these canonical works, though they're not technically the Torah, which is the first 5 books, oftentimes it's all referred to, the whole thing kind of takes on the name of the first 5, and gets referred to as the Torah. So the Torah comes to mean the written tradition passed down, centered on the first 5 books, which is the law and the story of Abraham and Moses and the Exodus and all that. The Mishnahs are called the oral Torah. And the tradition for Jews says, and this is part of the tension that we'll get to between Judaism and Christianity, but the Great Assembly says we're going to write down, or at least tradition holds, that they write down what's considered the oral Torah. And what the tradition says is Moses on the mountain got the written Torah from God, but God also told him other things, explaining the written Torah. And so Moses explained those things to Joshua, and Joshua explained those things to the judges and the Levites, and the judges and the Levites passed them on to other rulers. And so that passing on of the oral Torah, along with the written Torah, remains consistent from the perspective of the tradition all the way down through Ezra. And Ezra's reforms are in line, believed or understood to be in line with the oral Torah. Ezra is now explaining the written Torah, and he's not coming up with it on his own. He's drawing from the oral Torah that's been passed down generation after generation. So that's what the Mishnahs are. So the Talmud is what the Rabbinic Judaism uses. And it's centered around, you'll have a passage from the written Torah, and it'll be surrounded by a passage of Mishnah. And then around that is what's called Gemara, which is commentaries by later rabbis. And the commentaries are often in discussion and debate with each other. So the Torah, the Mishnah, the Gemara are all grouped together in the Talmud. You may have also heard the term Midrash. A Midrash means a specific teaching within the Mishnah and the Talmud. So a Midrash is a kind of a small segment of this. But the Talmud looks something like this next slide. Right? You have this central passage, and things read from right to left. So you have this central passage, probably from the written Torah. You have the surrounding passage from the oral Torah. And then around that, you have these commentaries by various later rabbis. This is how the text works for the Jews. For Judaism, modern Judaism. This is the basis of it for modern rabbinic Judaism. Really, since not just modern, but traditional, all the way back to this first century period when Judaism and Christianity split off. It's rooted in these various divides, these various ways of approaching the scriptures. So it's not just that historical narrative for the Jews. Now for the Christians, it's different. We're going to talk about Christians more later, but the Christians are going to read the Old Testament, as they would refer to it, the Hebrew Scriptures, through a different lens. But for Rabbinic Judaism, this is the lens through which you read the Torah. Right? We talked about before narratives. We all have our narratives. This is the interpretive lens. We don't just read the Torah. We read the Torah through an interpretive lens, which is what you got in that synopsis, right? That synopsis is very much an interpretive lens of most of the Hebrew Scriptures, from paraphrased and summarized from rabbinic readings of it, from Talmudic approaches to it. So take, for instance, the book of Judges, which I think is one of the more, I pick it because I think it's one of the more interesting, and it's really one of the easier ones to see this because of what this rabbinic reading in this summary does with it versus modern scholarship, just based on the text itself. And I'm talking a tremendous Jewish scholar, Robert Alter, who's not as drawn through the conservative kind of rabbinic approach as this website that we pulled this summary from. I use a lot of Robert Alter in my understanding of the book of Judges. He's a tremendous Jewish scholar, but also from the Christian standpoint is how Judges is read. But what did our paraphrase, what did our synopsis say about Judges? Well, the Talmud calls the book of Judges the book of the straight. Now, before we go any further, understand that the Talmud may say more than that about the book of the Judges, because this is this lens, right? And we'll find out about Judaism that a lot of it is a matter of discursive argument over what these things mean. So within the Talmud and within rabbinic schools, you're going to find debate over what something means. So this is even pulling from a specific reading of the Talmud of the Judges. But why does he say it does that? Well, because the ultimate goal of every Jew is to use his free will to work out what is wrong and right, using the Torah as a guide. Realize that from the Jewish perspective, there's this tension between God's providence and human free will. And it's a mystery. For most of Christian history, this is the same as well. Most of Christian tradition, with the exception of very strict Calvinism, which is a really almost Enlightenment, almost modern approach to the Christian tradition. We won't get into that here and now, but traditionally speaking, both faiths have this sense of a tension between God's providence and human action. But for the Jew, human responsibility is a huge part. Personal responsibility for action is central to rabbinic Judaism. And so this is a picture of, well, the ideal world is everybody's free to make their own choices. And so this is supposedly what happened in the time of the Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And this kind of chronicler in this synopsis says, you might think this sounds, like anarchy. But he goes on to say there was no anarchy. No anarchy. The vast majority of Jews were totally dedicated to Torah and were making decisions in the right way and didn't need someone to tell them what to do. This is the ideal situation. The tribes functioned as a loose confederation of states with strong central leadership arising only when the nation was threatened by an external enemy. This is a very rabbinic, Talmudic reading, idealistic, I would argue, reading of the book of Judges, but it's important to see that there are different approaches to reading it. My reading is strongly impacted by a very different Jewish look at it, secular scholarship and the Christian scholarship look at it. And we don't want to just say there's not a good reading and a bad reading, but at the same time, for this, we want to look sympathetically at different people's readings, understand how it shapes the way they understand things, right? So for a modern Jew who holds, as this writer seems to, from everything we've read in his synopsis, the importance of the Jews living in the land, their right to the land, the need to be a democratic and relatively free government in the land, Judges is therefore read in that way. A less nationalist Jew, Robert Alter, more literary focused, a very incredible Hebrew and English literary critic, Robert Alter, as well as most Christian readings, don't see this in this light, right? So there's a persistence between these ancient divides that we're going to talk about in a minute, and I'll clarify that. But just a quick look, summation of the book of Judges. So you have Othniel as a judge. This is after Joshua dies. This is one of the sons of Caleb, I think. And Israel is kind of doing things they shouldn't do, just a little bit. It's not bad. They're not in pure idolatry. They're not doing horrible things. They're just not doing some things they're supposed to do. It's not like they're doing some bad things. It's just they're failing to do some important things. And so Othniel takes the leadership role as a judge, and they start doing those right things. And isn't it wonderful? They have 40 years of peace. Well, then they start falling into little bits of idolatry and little bits of disobedience again. And so another power comes in from outside and starts to attack them and starts to oppress them, and they're made into sort of indentured servants. They have to pay tribute to this foreign king, and then it's not quite so glorious. Ehud is raised up as a as a judge. He goes in, he sneaks in, and he assassinates this king, and then leads the Jews to victory over their oppressors. And they have 80 years of peace. This looks pretty good, but it's a little more brutal. The description of what Ehud does is kind of gross. It talks about how, and the literary approach to this, right? His sword, it talks about this king being very fat, and Ehud's sword goes all the way into his gut, so that the hilt, even up to the hilt, and Ehud can't retrieve his sword. And it describes the smell. So it gets, the literary approach gets very gruesome, right? But they have 80 years of peace. Well, then they start to do some bad things again. They start to get into a little more idolatry. This is a problem. They're not supposed to be idolatrous. But there's this prophetess, Deborah, and she calls on this kind of tribal leader, Barak. And Barak leads the army, but Barak won't lead without Deborah. He's scared. So the kind of the idealism, the courage, your judges, your tribal leaders are less and less noble. In a sense, and not to create chaos or a big discussion about feminism, this is an ancient world. Okay, so in this world, a man is supposed to do this fighting part, right? But whereas Othniel was kind of like this ideal, he's a descendant of Caleb, great man Caleb, who was one of the big heroes under Moses' leadership. Othniel is one of his sons, great peace. Ehud, he's a man, right? Okay, it's a little bit more gruesome, but Ehud is a man of courage. He steps up, he takes action, he sets the people free. This is a good judge. Deborah is a prophetess. This is fine, it's good to have a prophetess. But Barak is supposed to be the leader, but he won't, suddenly the judge now. Barak, this kind of general for the judge, he doesn't want to, he's scared. He doesn't fully trust God. So there's this decline in the trust of the leadership, right? So he says to Deborah, God may be telling you this, but you got to believe God. You come with me to this battle, and I'll go to this battle. So he wins. But interestingly enough, because of that, the leader, Sisera, who's the main kind of oppressor of the Jews, this foreign general who's come in and been the lead oppressor, the most harsh, he runs from the battle and hides in this tent of this woman named Jael, and she gives him milk and covers him up, and he gets warm and falls asleep. And she assassinates him. She drives a tent peg through his head with a hammer. And there's this crushing image in the literature. It's very gruesome. So it's getting more gruesome. The judges are getting less ideal, we might say. And Gideon's the youngest brother. He's kind of scared. He's trying to thresh wheat in a cellar. Okay, threshing wheat requires wind. You don't have much wind in the cellar. This is how bad things are. The Jews have fallen into idolatry again. And yet, what goes on, some of them, they start to repent. And they're really not even that many of them repenting, because Gideon, God kind of initiates the repentance. God sends a message to Gideon. It's not like Gideon cries out to God. God sends an angel to Gideon. The angel says, Gideon, it's time for the people to repent. So there's the shift in the kind of impetus for action. It's no longer just people feel the pressure, people feel the harshness and the discipline of being ruled by outside powers. It's God actually has to send an angel to say, don't you realize, Gideon, that something's wrong? You're threshing wheat in a cellar. This isn't working very well. So Gideon secretly destroys the idols in his own father's house and in his own community. There's idols for Baal and Ashtaroth, which are the two primary gods of the Canaanite region that are constantly in competition with the Jewish worship. So Gideon destroys these idols. He raises up this army. They defeat the Midianites. Yay, isn't that wonderful? But he builds this golden ephod, which is like a shrine, basically. It's not necessarily an idol, but the law, the Jewish law actually says you shouldn't. Altars in the Jewish law are always just natural stones piled. You're not supposed to build an altar. Gideon builds this ephod out of gold, and so then people start to worship that, which is there's this kind of sense that maybe they're worshiping God at that ephod, but that they're not supposed to do it that way. So there's this form of idolatry that begins to happen even while Gideon is still alive. So there's 40 years of peace, but the idolatry is not totally gotten rid of. It's different from Deborah, different from Ehud, different from Othniel, right? The sin, the evil of the Israelites has gotten worse. The judges have gotten less noble. The action has gotten more gruesome, more crushing, more violent. And as soon as Gideon dies, Gideon has like multiple wives. He kind of takes advantage of being a hero. They want him to be king. He won't do that, but he's kind of this hero. He gets rich. He gets lots of wives. He has like 70 sons. And the sons, most of them honor their father's kind of memory. They won't become kings either. But the youngest son, who's actually his son by way of a prostitute, as if his multiple wives weren't enough. So you see here again this kind of decline in the character of the judges. This youngest son kills off all his other brothers and tries to become king, except for one brother is left, so there's this civil war. So after Gideon's 40 years of peace, there's still idolatry and there's civil war. Then there's just a couple of mentions of a couple more judges, but nothing spectacular. One of them manages 23 years of peace while he reigns, but not much else comes of it. Then there's this judge named Jephthah. The people have been still in idolatry, still haven't moved away from idolatry. And Jephthah makes a promise to God because he's asked to come help fight. He makes this promise to God. God, if you give me victory, I'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house to you. Now, number one, the Jewish God is not intended to be bargained with that way necessarily. Jacob, way back in the Pentateuch, one of the fathers that became Israel, tried that at the beginning of his life, but it's not necessarily looked on positively. So Jephthah takes this approach. God, you help me win this battle, I'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house. Well, he wins the battle, and then he gets home. And the first thing out to greet him is his daughter. Now, had Jephthah known his own stories, his own Israelite stories, Abraham, had he known the law that he was supposed to be following, especially as a judge, right? Had he known this, he would have known you don't sacrifice children. This is one of the things that God has said to the children of Israel, to the people of Israel. You don't sacrifice humans, right? This is part of the story of Abraham offering Isaac and then not sacrificing him. God promised providing a lamb. You read that story. Part of the point of that story is kind of an object lesson. Your God doesn't take human sacrifice. That's a key Jewish idea. It's in the law. Now, the law requires a redemptive sacrifice for the firstborn children, in line with that Passover thing, right? The whole Passover thing. That becomes part of the lifestyle of the Israelites, part of their worship, at least in the early Hebrew context, right? You have the first child, you're supposed to make a sacrifice of some kind of animal. So Jephthah, as a judge, should not have seen his daughter as a potential sacrifice. But he does, and he sacrifices her, and he's the judge. And he kind of governs for 6 more years, and there's kind of 6 years of peace, but yeah, not a good thing. Right? Then your next judge is Samson. He's supposed to be a Nazirite. The law prescribes certain actions for Nazirites. They're not supposed to drink wine or touch grapes. They're not supposed to touch dead things. They're not supposed to intermarry. No Jew is supposed to intermarry with people outside of the tribes of Israel. And they're not supposed to cut their hair. Everybody thinks that Samson, if you know the story, everybody thinks, oh, Samson lost his power because he cut his hair. That's not the point. The point of the haircut is that Samson had never obeyed any rule ever given to a Nazirite, and so he seems to think that the rules don't really apply to him. And in fact, for a judge, he's a very bad judge, because the only thing that ever motivates him to do anything against the oppressors of Israel is when they do something to him. The story of Samson is the Philistines are oppressing Israel. God wants to stop that oppression, so God kind of motivates the Philistines to do something to Samson. Samson's personally angry, he's personally offended, so he goes and fights a bunch of Philistines. But his whole life is about personal vengeance and not following any of the rules laid out for a Nazirite. And when he dies, it doesn't say anything about peace in the land. A lot of the previous judges, right, it'll actually say, Othniel died and there were 40 years of peace. Ehud died, there were 80 years of peace. Deborah came and there were 40 years of peace. Gideon governed for 40 years of peace. So there's this peace. There's this, one of them mentioned 23 years of peace. Jephthah, as bad as he was, as much as he messed up and didn't understand what he was supposed to be doing as a judge, he has 6 years of peace while he's governing. It's kind of like, yeah, you tried, Jephthah. You didn't get it, but you tried. Samson doesn't even seem to try. Doesn't seem to care. Personal vengeance is his motivation, and there's nothing about peace whatsoever. And the next chapter is where you see what, for that one interpretation, says this is what was, everybody was pretty much doing what they were supposed to do, is this verse about, in those days there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That sentence comes as part of an extended story. And what happens in this extended story is that there's a Levite who's supposed to be a priest of God, comes to serve in this rich man's house, serving as priest to an idol. Not supposed to have idols. As a Levite, you certainly shouldn't be worshiping idols for a rich man. Okay, so there's these Jews, and this Levite has a concubine, and so it sets it up. Here's a man with an idol, and a Levite comes to him and becomes priest to that idol, because in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Okay, then you follow this priest and his concubine. They're traveling. They avoid a Jebusite city, a non-Jewish city, to go stay in a town of other Jews, Gibeah. Gibeah of the tribe of Benjamin, this Jewish town. Should be a Jews town, right? They should be safe there. And it says, just before saying they went into this town, it kind of makes a shift in the narrative. It's this character, this Levite. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel. But then instead of finishing the phrase there, it says, so the Levite goes to the town. He's traveling, he avoids the Jebusite town, he avoids the non-Jews, goes to Gibeah, this town of Benjamin, and he's going to sleep in the town square. Now, hospitality is a huge point, right? We talked about hospitality with Hindus, right? Hospitality in ancient cultures is a huge deal, but nobody at first is showing him hospitality. And then this one man who is from another tribe, but a Jew, lives in Gibeah, says, you don't need to stay in the town square, it's not safe. Well, wait, not safe in a Jewish town? This shouldn't be. But that's what he says, because in those days there was no king in Israel. And so he takes him in. Well, as night begins to fall, the men of the town come banging on this man's door, saying, send that man that came into town out, we want to rape him. Now, what story does this sound like? It's Sodom and Lot. So in those days there was no king, and Gibeah, which should be a good Jewish town where a good Jewish Levite is safe to stay the night, is acting like Sodom, the symbol of evil for the Jews of this literature, right? They're inhospitable and they're violent and want to rape this, and they end up raping the man's concubine until she dies. It's a gang rape. It's this horrendous, gruesome, horrible story. This is not about people pretty much doing what was right with a few examples. This, from most scholars' perspectives, is actually written as kind of promoting the idea of Israel needs a king. Israel needs a king. Because when everybody, and that story ends, and it ends the book of Judges with, in those days there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But you see, that's a very different way of interpreting those stories than what you read in that synopsis, right? It's a very different lens of looking at it. If we were going to make the argument, I would argue that that textual literary approach is a better reading. But that aside, understand that this is part of the discussion that happens between various Jewish groups and between various Jewish groups and Christianity as an offshoot of Judaism or of the Hebrew religion, right? So it's what comes out of these types of discussions and how you read the scriptures and how you understand the rabbis and which rabbis you take more seriously and how you read the Torah versus the Talmud, and the conflict you'll see in the New Testament is between Jesus and the Pharisees, often over interpretation of the Torah. So this is key to understand, because this is from a Jewish website, and this is key for understanding this break that happens. It says the Pharisees were a sect that was in the main led by scribes and teachers. The Pharisees did not feel bound by what was written in the Bible, but by the Bible as understood according to Jewish rabbinic tradition. The Talmudic rabbis were ideological descendants of the Pharisees. Thus, in traditional Judaism, this is from a Jewish scholar, right? We as Jews live not by what is written in the Bible, the written Torah, but by the Bible as interpreted and understood by the Jewish rabbinic tradition, the oral Torah. So this debate is going to be central to the formation of modern Judaism and Christianity. What is your authority? Is it just, how do you read this text? How do you read the laws of Moses? How do you read the history of Israel? How do you understand it? And we all read history in a sense backwards. We read from where we are. We see this, it can be a problem. It's something we need to pay attention to, because if we want to understand what's actually being said in an earlier text, we have to do our best to try to get back to that. There again, though, that's not the point of this course, right? The point of this course is we want to understand what modern Judaism is and where it came from, what Christianity is, where it came from. And eventually we'll talk about what Islam is and where it came from, and what they do with these stories, how these narratives impact them. But to understand that, you have to see that though Judaism and Christianity both hold to this Hebrew narrative, they read it in very different ways. So that thing with Judges, I just wanted to give you a kind of a clear sample of how that looks in a modern context. We'll get a few more before we finish. But here again, this is where we're going to be moving. This is where we're going to getting to, because this is where the modern religions are formed. Romans take over. Herod the Great. Herod is not a great Jew. He claims Jewish heritage, claims heritage from the royal line, doesn't really have it. Makes a lot of political and moral compromises. Really not a great guy. So then you have, this is the time when you have Jesus and the early disciples, the early church, and then 70, the year 70 AD, or the Common Era, Jerusalem is conquered by the Romans, and the temple is destroyed. And this is really an important event for the formation of rabbinic Judaism. Because what we'll see is that there are these various schools during this time period. Before the destruction, so between the time of the Great Assembly that I mentioned, and we'll get more into that next time, between that time and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, or 70 the Common Era, you probably have more than this, but the primary groupings within this Jewish context, and I've left one off accidentally, but there are the Sadducees, who are largely connected to the temple and the priestly line, the line of heritage, the line of kind of, a lot of people look at the Bible like, why do they mention all these so-and-so, beget so-and-so, so-and-so was so-and-so's father? Because the priesthood and the nobility are passed down through the family. You have to have a pure line. So the Sadducees are descended from that priestly line. They know their descent. They have their line of descent. They hold on to that. It's incredibly important. Their whole life is built around the temple. They're not so connected to the ideas of the Great Assembly. They pretty much die off with the temple, right? Because they're centered on the temple and the priestly line. The temple's gone. The role of the priests are gone. There have occasionally been movements that come up that are connected back to the Sadducees within Judaism, but they're rare. Most traditional rabbinic Jews, modern Judaism, connect themselves back to the Pharisees. The Pharisees were often in conflict with the Sadducees because they valued this rabbinic literature, just held it as tremendously important. So that's a key distinction. Interestingly, those are the two groups that Jesus has the most conflict with, Sadducees and the Pharisees. And they work together, often butting heads in the Sanhedrin, the kind of the law court, the local law court for Judah at this time. They're the Zealots. The Zealots are these groups that keep having violent uprisings. They want to overthrow Rome. They kind of want to force the hand of God, right, to send the Messiah and conquer Rome, because Rome's oppressing us and we're trying to be obedient and God needs us in to conquer. So we need to stand up. In the past, there's always been a hero that stood up. Think about these stories, right? Gideon, Ehud, Joshua, the King David, all these different stories where God raised up a warrior, and the warrior delivered us from the oppressors. So the Zealots have this kind of aspect of, this is what's important from the old narratives. This is what we need to draw on. The Essenes is like this monastic community. They separate themselves, and they basically say, look, what matters is the Torah and the prophets, and we're looking for the coming Messiah. The prophets, Daniel, the book of Enoch, which is not in the core of the Hebrew canon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they prophesied the Messiah, the coming Messiah that was going to set us free. You Zealots are wrong because we can't do this ourselves. We need God to send the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, we'll be ready. But we need to make ourselves holy enough for the Messiah. And you see, you Sadducees are wrong because this temple that you have, Herod had a hand in that. And Herod's a corrupt, wicked, not a true Jew, and that's not a pure temple. So I don't care about your priestly line. You're not right, Sadducees. Pharisees, you think you're good, but you're not good enough. You're in collusion with these Zealots sometimes. You're in collusion with these Sadducees sometimes. You're just getting by. Your righteousness is a pretense. And the Essenes are like, we've got to make ourselves completely holy so that the Messiah can come. So there's different views in this kind of first century Jewish world over how we're going to get delivered from the captivity that's continued from Babylon and the Persians and the Greeks and now the Romans. How do we get out from under this oppression? When is God going to deliver his people? How will that happen? So there are these different views. There's also the Herodians, and the Herodians are basically, forget that. Let's just get along. Let's, do your best. Tax collectors, people who colluded politically with the Roman power structure, with Herod, not looked upon highly by most other Jews. Herodians are just, they're the ones who kind of embrace a lot of the Greek way of life and still kind of keep some Jewish. So that's the one I didn't put on there. But these four, Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, Essenes, these are four key approaches to what do we do with the Torah? What do we do with the promises of God? Where is this look for Messiah? Is he going to come? When's he going to come? How's he going to come? What do we need to do about him coming? And then there are the Christians. At first they were called the Nazarenes because Jesus is kind of hails from Nazareth. Sorry. They later become called Christians, but they essentially are saying, no, the Messiah has come. Look, it lines up with these prophets and what they say. It just looks different than what we thought it would look like. So that's where we're going to start from next time. Those are the key schools that come out of various ways of approaching these old stories. Okay, so the Hebrew stories, they're foundational for all of these. The question is, what part? How do you interpret? How do you read them? There again, Rabbinic Judaism comes from the Pharisees, mostly. And so that's when we start looking at Judaism, that's what we're going to be looking at. But we're going to talk a little more about these divides from the first century.